Well, welcome everybody once again to the briefing room. And today we are going to be talking about one of the most notorious concentration camps in World War II, Buchenwald, with my guest, Flint Whitlock. Flint, welcome to the briefing room.
Well, great to be here with you, John. As you can see
Oh.
from my background here, I'm in Colorado, Rocky Mountains. Um,
Looks like you've
and
had all day.
yeah, well, it kind of looks like the Winter Olympics, but we actually have no snow here. So we've
Oh.
been in a wave for the last 3 months. So we'd like to get some snow.
Oh, we haven't had hardly anything here. It's all winter.
Uh, uh,
We're going to talk today about the Beasts of Buchenwald, your book, and this. Do you know a lot of things about World War II really disturbed me, but concentration camps disgust me, absolutely disgust me.
as well they should.
And this book is volume one of the Buchenwald trilogy. What are the other two books? Because this seems to go from beginning to end. So,
Yeah, well, when I was doing research on this project, I think I started it about 20 years ago. I had no idea that it would end up being 3 volumes, and I'm working on a fourth volume now about
no.
one of the people who's at Buchenwald. But I think what happened when I was serving with the U.S. Army back in the 1960s, I had the opportunity to go to Dachau
Mm-hmm.
outside Munich, which is where most Americans, Westerners, Brits would go to see what a concentration camp was like. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, most of it had already been torn down because the buildings were pestilential at best, and but they kept it as a memorial. And what I didn't realize at the time was there were other camps that had been liberated at the end of the war that were also uh, had been turned into memorials.
Mm-hmm.
And Buchenwald was one of those. And I discovered it while I was working on doing research in Germany following the Battle of the Bulge. And a group of American prisoners were taken into deep Germany near the Czech border and sent to work alongside inmates from the Buchenwald concentration camp, which was just a few miles up the road. And this was in the early 2000s. The Soviet Union had collapsed in the late 80s. And so tourists from the West were now finally being able to go behind the Iron Curtain. And when I saw on this research trip how close I was to Buchenwald, I said, well, I need to take a side trip there. So I did and investigated it and was just blown away with the not only the size of the camp, but the cruelty that had been perpetrated against the prisoners who unfortunately had been incarcerated. And I went into the bookshop that they had there at the visitor center, and I noticed there were only one or two books in English about the camp. I quickly bought those and decided to do some more research and see what I could, if I could write a book about that. Well, it turned out, I guess you could say I wrote 2.5 books because there was the one you held up, the Beasts of Buchenwald.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third in the trilogy was called Buchenwald Hell on a Hilltop. And the second book was, I guess I'm listed on the cover as the co-author, but I was really the editor. It was a book by a Frenchman named Louis Gros, Gros, who had been incarcerated at Buchenwald as a teenager. He'd
Oh
been
wow.
arrested in France along with his father for putting up anti-Nazi posters in their hometown.
Mm-hmm.
So he and his father and a few thousand of the Frenchmen were sent off to the east. And they both ended up in Buchenwald. So my publisher and I requested of Louis that we be allowed to translate his work into English and offer it as the third volume in the trilogy. And
Wow.
graciously he allowed us to do that. But it was just one of those serendipitous discoveries where you don't really expect to find something that
Yeah.
is going to change uh, the trajectory of life in many ways.
Yeah. And I mean, the most notorious people who ran Buchenwald were Carl and Eiselcar.
Also,
I say Eisel all the time.
well,
It's Ilsecar.
it's not
Ilsecar.
a usual name.
It is. Um, can you tell me a little? Can you tell the listeners a little bit about Carl Cox's early life and how he became an SS officer?
Yeah, Carl Otto Koch was a very undistinguished person, and I've made the observation that if you were to go into a supermarket and you saw Carl and Ilsa walking down the aisle buying groceries, they would be totally ordinary people. You wouldn't realize that they wielded the power of life and death over thousands of people and Buchenwald. Carl grew up. He fought in World War One. He was a military veteran, and then after the Treaty of Versailles happened, and he was basically mustered out of the service along with a few million German soldiers. He just kind of bounced around with various odd jobs, nothing terribly important. But then when the Nazis came to power, he said, "Well, this could be interesting." So he joined the Nazi Party and applied to join the SS, and he was accepted into the SS. And he was given some assignments in various concentration camps, either as a supervisor, eventually as a commandant in several camps. And he just kept going up through the ranks of the SS in the concentration camp world, like I would say. He was made the commandant of the Sachsenhausen camp outside of Berlin, and it was a brand new camp, and he was a particularly ruthless individual, and he felt that he was going to go far in Nazi circles. And that's where he met a young lady named Ilsa Kohler, and she was quite a bit younger than he was. She had also joined the Nazi Party, and I think they met in a restaurant or a dance hall or something in Dresden, where he was spending a little bit of time. And eventually they got married. He had already been married and divorced by that point. And then in end of 1936, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and a few of the other high-ranking Nazis said, let's build another big camp. They already had Dachau, they already had Sachsenhausen, but the number of prisoners being arrested and taken to these camps was growing exponentially. And so they looked around Germany and said, well, Weimar would be a good place for that. It was about 100 miles south of Berlin, the cultural center of Germany. I mean, Schiller, Goethe, Beethoven, Bach, all of the cultural figures of Germany had at one time or another lived and worked in Weimar. And so for whatever reason, that seemed to be a good spot for the concentration camp. And in the summer of 1937, the Germans began building this camp, and Karl Koch was named the commandant of that camp. And so he and his wife Ilsa moved in, and basically for the next several years ran the place like it was their own personal fiefdom.
Yeah, how did that partnership influence the command structure of Buchenwald?
That's a good question. I think his wife never had any official capacity. But during my research phase, I kind of got the feeling that she was the one who wore the pants in the family.
Hmm.
That Ilsa was a very demanding person, and the two of them, were, I guess you could call them despicable people.
Yeah.
Even though they were married, had three kids, one of whom died in infancy, they were just, they thought they owned the place, they owned the world. Carl was having affairs with women. Ilsa was carrying on affairs with the camp doctor and the deputy commandant, and just all sorts of strange things happening there because they had the sense of entitlement. Uh,
Hmm.
Here he was, the leading concentration camp commandants in Germany, and felt that he was above the law. And as it turned out, he got his just desserts in the end by the SS. But
Yeah.
we can go into that
Yeah.
point here.
What were the early days like in it Buchenwald with the creation and the purpose of it?
Well, it was designed primarily to hold political prisoners. It was not like a Jewish extermination camp like Auschwitz,
Hmm.
Birkenau. It was mainly to incarcerate people who had proven themselves or were suspected of being enemies of the Third Reich. And they were, the prisoners were uh, mistreated horribly. I mean, you've read the book, you know
Yeah.
the kind of living conditions that they were forced to endure. The roll calls twice a day, morning and evening, where the men in their striped cotton uniforms had to stay in detention for hours on end, no matter what the weather was like. If anybody moved or spoke or collapsed, they were beaten by the guards and the capos. And it was just, the food was, barely enough to keep anybody alive. Sanitary conditions were just, you wouldn't put a barnyard animal in the kind of conditions that they were in. And then it was 12 hours a day, hard labor. Men were working in the quarry there, uh, chopping limestone blocks and carrying them on their backs up the ramp out of the quarry. Buchenwald was one of those places that supplied a lot of building materials
Mm.
to the Third Reich, and so the quarry was busy 7 days a week during the hours of daylight. The treatment by the guards, you know, you can hardly imagine how terrible the inmates were uh,
Yeah.
treated by the guards who beat them, whipped them, who hung them up by their arms. They were forced to, it was called the Saxonian salute, where they would crouch down and put their hands behind their heads. And you can only do that for maybe 30 seconds before
Yeah.
your thighs give out. And whenever anybody fell to the ground, the guards would come and begin beating them. So it was just, you know, almost beyond description. I tried as
Yeah.
best I could to describe the indescribable. And every day when I finish writing a few pages, I would just kind of have to go take a walk to clear my head
Yeah.
of the awfulness.
Yeah, I bet. I mean, I've said it a couple of times on the show that this show actually gives me nightmares now. I've been doing it for so
Yeah.
long. It just gives me nightmares. The one thing that I've always wanted to ask about concentration camps, the the thing that really disgusts you is the filth of the
Mm.
camp. Are they clean camps when people move in and it just becomes filthy, or do they purposely make it filthy?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Certainly, when the barracks were first built, they were clean,
Mm.
but they quickly became infected with lice, with bed bugs, with the inmates were sick. Many of them they came down with typhus and pneumonia and all
Yeah.
sorts of other diseases and passed that on. I mean, you're living in a basically a box,
Yeah.
800 or 1,000 other people in, I almost hesitate to call them beds. They're more like shelves
Mm.
where you get 4 or 6 men in, kind of all huddling together to stay warm. No blankets, no mattresses. Their food bowls were used for pillows. And so whatever disease or illness somebody had, they pass it on to everybody else. Certainly, they had cleanup details where one of the inmates
Mm.
or several inmates would have to sweep it out every day, but there was no way to keep them
No.
clean. There was no true washing facilities. The latrines, in
Mm.
many cases, holes in the ground, and the guards delighted in pushing the inmates into the filth, and there was no way to wash them. So
Yeah.
I can imagine walking into one of those places, you would just be, your senses would be assaulted by the terrible smells that were there.
Well, you describe them as shelves, and it's not just like bunk beds, one on top of another. It's like on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. And
Yeah,
I was thinking to myself, what would be the best bunk to be in? But there isn't one. There isn't one.
it
I
wouldn't be
mean,
because
if you're
the
if
guys
you're
who had dysentery, you know,
yes, yeah, I was just going to
there's a
say
cascade of feces pouring on the people below them. So maybe the top bunk would be the best.
probably that. Yeah, because when you were describing it, I thought, oh my god, can you imagine being at the bottom of that?
No,
Jeez, ugh. No.
no.
And there's a lot of infamous stories about Buchenwald. How do you separate myth from reality?
That's a good question. I did a lot of research, read just about every book that was out there, quite a few of which were written by survivors of the
Mm.
camp. I interviewed a few of the survivors who are unfortunately now all gone, what they left behind, their written record or their oral history that they imparted to me. And it's like anything. You're going to find some things that seem to be fiction,
Mm.
and the more you dig into it, the more you realize, no, this wasn't fiction. This really did happen. And then there were the war crimes trials, where many of the people who were involved in these perpetrations of humanity, where they were on trial, sworn to tell the truth. There's still, some things that might be questioned as, were they truthful or were they just hearsay? But I tried to be as honest and name my sources as I could,
Mm.
so that anybody else who reads the books can do their own research and say,
Yeah.
that's what that guy really did say. So, uh, without actually having been there myself,
Yeah.
I had to rely on the words of those people who were there
Yeah.
themselves and whatever the historical records were. One of the things about Buchenwald, they have a memorial there. It's their offices are established in one of the SS barracks buildings, and they have a huge research library, and they have, the Germans were very strict record keepers.
Mm.
And so a lot of the stuff that was used in the Nuremberg trials, for example, came right from what the Germans said that they were doing.
Yeah.
You can't deny something that you wrote down and have pictures of and said, yes, I did it.
Yeah.
And so, having that type of resource was really invaluable for this project, which spanned several years and several visits back to
Yeah.
the Malden.
Thank God they were good record keepers as well, because we wouldn't know hardly
Yeah,
anything of what went
that's
on.
right. That's right.
So they shot himself in the foot really with doing that.
Yeah.
Can you tell the audience a little bit about the cruelty that Ilse Koch inflicted on the concentration camp?
Oh, we could be here for hours talking
Yeah, yeah,
all the nasty things that she did. I think, well, on the back of this book, Beasts of Buchenwald, it's popping in and out. There we go.
yeah.
We see a picture of Ilsa and Carl with their two kids. They had a son named Artvin,
Mhm.
and a little girl there is named Gisela. And when I went to the National Archives to do some research there, there was there were two photo albums that were taken from the cook's home after the camp was liberated, and somehow ended up in the U.S. National Archives. And when I held those actual items in my hands, I got chills down my back because page after page, you would see, this loving family playing with their kids, and it just, looked like a normal family. And yet, also apparently had this sadistic streak that I hope comes out in the books to talk about what she did. It is said by many of the people in the sources that I went through that she loved horseback riding, and her husband Carl had an indoor riding arena built for her so she could ride her horse in all kinds of weather. But she would also, when the weather was good, would ride around the periphery of the camp, and she would see prisoner details out there working maybe on a road or a garden or a fence or something like that. And in the summertime, they would be working without shirts, and she'd ride by. And reportedly, if anybody looked at her, she would tell whoever was supervising the work detail to beat that prisoner for looking at her. And she wore, I guess you could say, provocative outfits while riding, so it would be hard not to look at her. And then she's associated with something that I think everybody who knows anything about World War II has heard about. It's called the Human Skin Lampshade Project. And on these rides around the camp, if she saw somebody with a particularly interesting tattoo, she would tell the person supervising that work detail, well, take down that guy's number and let us have it. And within a few days, that prisoner would disappear. He would be killed. Skin where the tattoo was would be removed. And they had a little cottage industry there where they made household objects out of the tattooed skin. It could be the sheath for a knife, could be a pair of gloves, could be a book cover, an album cover, house slippers, lampshades. And these were sold to other SS camps and units and officers throughout the entire Nazi SS system. And we do know that that really happened because it wasn't just one person saying it.
Yeah.
Now, Ilsa's involvement in that is still maybe up, up for debate. At the war crimes trial, where she was accused of committing these atrocities, they did produce these tattooed items, human skin items, and presented them as evidence in the trials. But whether she could actually be pinned down and say she's the one who caused it, there's still some question about whether or how much her involvement was in that enterprise.
Yeah, it's funny. This episode comes out a week after I do an episode on Ed Gein, who was influenced by Ilse.
Aha.
How did the camp evolve as World War II evolved?
Well, the camp kept expanding. I think originally they had enough barrack space for about 10,000 individuals. They had barracks for them, and they kept having to expand the camp
Hmm.
without any increase in, you might say, amenities for the prisoners. There were no, bathing facilities or showers. I mean, you might get a little cold water out of the pipe, once in a while, but and then as the camp grew and more prisoners came in, after the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, there were thousands of Soviet soldiers who were sent to Buchenwald.
Hmm.
And I believe the number that I saw and wrote about was 7,000 Soviet prisoners were murdered at Buchenwald, and their bodies dumped in a mass grave.
Hmm.
Their names weren't even taken down, so nobody knows who the soldiers were who were there. Again, as the camp kept growing, as more and more other countries were taken by the Nazis. More and more facilities had to be built for them. There was a part of the camp on the northwest corner of the main camp called the Little Camp. And that was kind of a temporary housing facility. They put up some prefabricated horse stables, and men were, moved in there, and the shelves for sleeping were put in there. And it was, and those even became overcrowded. I mean, they went from 800 prisoners per building to 1,000 or 2,000 per building.
My
And it was
God.
just, almost overwhelming. I mean, it was overwhelming. So the Germans could take care of that number of people. The prisoners were often sent out, or you might say leased out,
Mm.
to industry in Germany, like the Messerschmitt aircraft factories, or IG Farben, or some of the other major industrial concerns in Germany, to as slave laborers.
Mm.
Many of them went to work in the armaments industries, making rifles and tanks and aircraft and whatnot, because most of the able-bodied German men were already in the service. And so the slave laborers became the source of cheap, cheap labor for the Nazi regime.
Were there any changes in the SS or in policy as the war dragged on?
Not really, no. There were three branches of the SS. One was called the Allgemeine SS. They were basically the general bureaucrats. Um, there was the Waffen SS, that was the armed forces, the SS divisions that were out in the field fighting, and then the branch of the SS that ran the concentration camps is called the
Mm-hmm.
Totenkopf, Death's Head SS. But the three branches stayed pretty separate during the war. Now, there were occasions because of manpower needs when combat casualties would get too uh, heavy that some of the Totenkopf soldiers were taken from the concentration camps and put on the front line with the Waffen SS. But that didn't happen until much later in. So I would say there wasn't a lot of change in terms of
Yeah.
the structure of the SS that ran the camps.
Thank you. Um, and why was Karl Koch transferred to Majdanek?
My Danik.
Majdanek.
Yeah. Well, what had happened? This is the start of the downfall of the Koch dynasty in
Yeah.
Luxembourg. That Karl was skimming money off the top that should have gone into the SS coffers. That when the inmates were rented out as slave labor by industry, the industry would pay Buchenwald for the use of prisoners. And so Karl would always take a little off the top, send the rest to the SS treasurer back in Berlin, And he was really enriching himself and enriching his wife. Ilsa, she was notorious for having furs and nice dresses and jewelry and things of that sort, which was, all a result of money that Carl was taking that should not have gone to him or to Ilsa. And the SS hierarchy started to get wind that there was something amiss here, that something wasn't quite right. Also, too, when before prisoners were cremated, if they had gold teeth, or the gold was taken out of their mouths and melted down, and Carl would keep a certain amount of that gold and send some of it, maybe half, maybe not quite half, to the SS, just trying to keep them from being suspicious. And so at one point, he was determined that he was ripping off his employer, the SS, and they did some investigation, and they determined, yes, there are some irregularities here, two sets of books, and what's Carl doing with the rest of it, and why are he and his wife living such luxurious lifestyles, if you can say living at a concentration camp with luxurious.
Yeah.
But he eventually was transferred from Buchenwald to Majdanek, which was going to be and probably was the largest concentration camp in the whole Nazi realm. There were about 20,000 camps. Some are very small. If you've seen Schindler's List, they were renting out prisoners to small groups, and so there were all these little sub camps all over Germany and the occupied countries. And so the SS said, well, we want to continue investigating Karl Koch, but we don't want him to know that we're on his trail. So we're going to transfer him to Poland and put him in charge of the Majdanek camp. And they did that. Ilsa stayed behind in Weimar. A new commandant came in named Hermann Pister. Karl said, when things calm down here in Poland at Majdanek, Ilsa, I'll call for you, and you kids can come join me. But they never did, because he was eventually transferred to like an SS postal in the field. You talk about being demoted. I mean, he's now in charge of the SS mail somewhere in Poland. So this investigation into his corruption kept going on and on. The SS didn't care about the fact that tens of thousands of people were being killed and tortured at Buchenwald. They cared about the fact they weren't getting their cut. And so they eventually arrested him and put him in an SS prison for a few weeks. And then a couple of weeks before the liberation of Buchenwald took place in April 11th of 1945, he's brought back to Weimar, and he's taken back to Buchenwald, and he's stood up in front of an SS firing squad and killed, and then his body is burned in crematorium, kind of like it was a just way to end his career. But it all seemed rather ironic to me that all of this other terrible stuff is going on against other human beings, but the SS was more concerned about the corruption and not getting their cut of the money that he was taking from other operations that he was overseeing.
Yeah, I think that's disgusting that they care if people are skimming off the top, but they don't care about human, the human suffering that's going on.
Exactly.
And how did the conditions at Buchenwald change towards the end of the war?
Well, towards the end of the war, they just got worse and worse because more and more inmates were showing up. As I said, it was originally designed to be a camp of, hold maybe 8 to 10,000 people. By the end of Buchenwald's lifespan, I guess you could call it, they had about 50,000 people who were crammed in. And right in April of 45, as the Americans and Brits were advancing from the west and the Soviets were advancing from the east, Himmler makes the decision, we've got to evacuate all of the POWs from these camps, because if the Allies find these camps, they're going to come looking for me, because I'm the head SS guy. And so he sent out orders. He said, close your camps down, send the prisoners on marches to oblivion. There was no plan for what to do with these hundreds of thousands of prisoners. And so they were just, the gates were open, the men were lined up, and they were sent on road marches with SS guards who would shoot them if they fell behind. And there was just an idea, we want to keep these out of the hands of the advancing Allies. Well, before that actually could happen at Buchenwald, Patton's Third Army was moving in that direction towards Weimar. And in early April, they were getting uncomfortably close, and Buchenwald hadn't been evacuated yet. They didn't know, how long can we wait before we get the hell out of here? And in the meantime, over the past year or two, the prisoners at the camp were actually either stealing weapons, or those who worked in the weapons manufacturing plants that was there were gathering parts and making weapons, and bribing guards and getting ammunition and grenades and things of that sort, because they felt that if the Allies get close, the Germans are going to kill us all. And we want to go down fighting if it comes to that. And so eventually they did have enough weapons so that when they heard the advance of the American Army, specifically the 6th Armored Division, approaching from the west, there was some shooting that was going on in the town just to the west of the camp. The prisoners said, okay, this is our chance. Now we can revolt. So this is it's been called the only self-liberated concentration camp. But it was self-liberated in the span of maybe 3 hours before the Americans arrived, broke down the gate, and saw what was going on. One of the other things, we think nowadays, well, everybody knew about what was going on, and the death camps and the mass extermination. But not very many people knew that. And certainly the advancing armies didn't know that, 5 miles down the road, we're going to run into a concentration camp. Nobody really ever heard of a concentration camp. There were no lectures given to units saying, in case you come upon a concentration camp, here's what you're supposed to do. It came as a total surprise to the Americans, and I'm sure the Brits too, when they liberated places like Bergen-Belsen and other camps up north. And so when the Americans got there, what the hell is this? Here's 20,000, which was about the number of people who were there after they started evacuating the others from the camp. There are 20,000 really smelly, dirty people who are skin and bones, skeletons wearing striped cotton uniforms, and they're screaming and yelling and crying, and, rushing, wanting to touch us, wanting, to hug us. What is this? And I fault the high command for not letting the soldiers know you could encounter this, and here's what you do. Some of the soldiers were so shocked by what they saw, they started handing out their rations, which were so rich that they killed a lot of the prisoners who ate them. So it was, a totally chaotic situation that should have been better handled.
I find that amazing that people didn't know, because there was so many concentration camps all over Europe. And it was a really well-kept secret, open secret. It's just amazing.
Well, certainly, I know many of the people in Weimar knew that there was a camp up there. I mean, saw it being built. They saw trucks coming in with people who were going to either build it or live in it. When Weimar was bombed, there were prisoners who were taken out of the camp to help clean up the city. So people, knew,
Yeah.
like, like, a lot of things in life you don't want to ask for fear that you're going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
And if you, and if you did know, or let's say you were a German civilian living in Weimar, who would you, who would you go to and tell, hey,
Yeah.
there's a,
Yeah.
there's a
True.
terrible concentration camp on top of the hill outside of town.
Hmm.
If you went to the police, you're going to be arrested. You're going to be in the
Yeah,
terrible
that's true.
on the
Yeah.
hill outside of town. So it was one of those things where, better not to rock the boat, better not to say anything, because who knows what happened to me and my family if I suddenly
Yeah.
start getting, too suspicious about what's going on or wanting to blow the whistle. I think many of the civilians were between a rock and a hard place. They would be in trouble if they said anything or tried to expose what was going on, because who do
Yeah.
you tell? The government's completely in the hands of the Nazis. So it was a terrible situation.
And a big part of your book is the aftermath. And how did the trials unfold? The
Well, before
war
we
crime
go to the
trials.
trials, if we have a minute here, uh,
Mhm.
Eisenhower and Bradley and Patton had all come across a subcamp of Buchenwald called uh, Ordorf, a few miles to the west. And that was the first, I think Eisenhower even knew there were such things. And he and Bradley and Patton, some of the commanders, took a tour of this, and there were just corpses lying all over. There was a big pyre made out of railroad ties and railroad tracks that burnt corpses were on this, and Patton was so overcome with emotion that he went behind the building and threw up. I mean, all blood and guts. George Patton couldn't
Yeah.
stand what he was seeing, and they were given a demonstration. There were still a few prisoners that the Germans had killed in Ordorf, and they were kind of given a demonstration or lecture on how the inmates were treated, how they were whipped and beaten and killed. And Eisenhower, he was just so sickened by this that he said, I'm gonna contact General Marshall, George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff back in Washington. And he said, I want Marshall to send over a congressman from Washington, D.C. to see this. I want Marshall to send over newspaper and magazine editors and reporters and photographers to document this, because I'm afraid that at some point in the future, there are going to be people who say, well, it never happened. That was just a hoax. And one of the things that Eisenhower said that I've never forgotten was, our soldiers may not know what they're fighting for, but when they see this, they'll know what they're fighting against. And so he directed units that weren't in direct frontline combat with the Germans to see Buchenwald, and they had a lot of the prisoners act as, I guess you'd call them, tour guides, and take them through the camp and show them what had transpired there many years.
How did the war crime trials
Oh,
unfold?
right. In October of 1945, the Nuremberg war crimes trials began. The International Military Tribunal, the formal name. And there were 24 leading Nazis: Hermann Goering, Albert Speer, Admiral Raeder. I mean, they were just, from the military, the political, the industrial sides that were kind of representative of the broad scope of what the Third Reich had been doing for the last 12 years. And so those people were tried. About 12 of them were hung after the trial was over. But then there was a series of additional, I think there were 12 or 14 more trials that were held in Germany. And one of the trials was the concentration camp trial. There was another one called the doctor's trial, in which several of the doctors at Buchenwald who had performed medical experiments on the prisoners while they were still alive were put on trial. And then there was they called the concentration camp trial, in which 32 or 34 individuals with some connection to half a dozen concentration camps were put on trial. And Ilse Koch was the only female who was on trial at that particular time. She was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But because of the post-war political situation where the Cold War was starting to, to happen between East and West, and the Americans felt that it was important not to alienate the West Germans because they were going to be on the front lines, they were going to be the bulwark, in case the Russians decided to make a move into West Germany. It was felt by John J. McCloy, who was the civilian overseer of defeated Germany, to kind of soft pedal it. Let's not have any more war crimes trials. And those people who were sentenced to death, sentenced to life in prison, sentenced to 20 years, we'll release them all. We'll commute their sentence. So Ilse was one of those who had her sentence commuted. Well, as soon as she was released from prison, she was arrested by the West German authorities, put on trial again, and again given a life sentence. And interestingly enough, she did go to prison. So this would have been about 1947, 48. When she was in the women's prison in Eichach, a little town, she had become pregnant by one of the kitchen workers at that prison. She had an affair with this guy, and she gave birth to a son who was then taken away from her and given to a foster family. And it was maybe 16, 18 years later that her son, whose name was Uwe Kohler, he had her maiden name, realized that Ilse Koch was his mother. I don't know how he figured it, and was in prison. And he started visiting her. So every Saturday during visitation hours, he would go to the prison and they would sit and chat for an hour or so, develop a relationship that had not happened before. And then one day he went to the prison to see his mom, and the prison authorities said, "No, well, I'm sorry, but she committed suicide in her cell last night." Mm. And so that part of the saga ends rather ignominiously.
Good. I'm glad. How did the media see the Ilse Koch trial?
Well, obviously, it was a very big thing. I know in the U.S. papers and probably also the British papers and other papers around the world that these trials were going on, and the perpetrators, the men who started the worst World War in history, were going to face justice. But when you look at the totality of it, millions of Germans were implicit in some of the atrocities that took place, and only about 4,000 or 5,000 ever stood trial. Justice, I don't think was really served. But the newspapers, while the Nuremberg tribunal was going on, I mean, there was something in there every day about what was happening. Yeah. But I think there was a sense of, especially among the West Germans, the war is over, we lost, we need to get on with life, we've got to repair our cities and our social structure. Can we please go back to some semblance of normalcy? Mm-hmm. And the West Germans were becoming very unhappy with the ongoing trials, and that's why one of the reasons McCloy decided to put an end to it, just to solidify West Germany's being on the side of the West. Yeah.
And finally, looking back now, what does the Beasts of Buchenwald tell us about cruelty and bureaucracy?
I wrote the Beasts of Buchenwald back in, it was published in 2011. It was about 4 or 5 years of work of research and writing on that. And so we're almost a couple of decades after that. And as I
Yeah.
was skimming through this prior to our chat here
Mm.
today, it occurred to me that there's so much happening in the US today that mirrors what had happened 80, 90 years ago in Germany.
Yeah.
It's very scary. And if anything, maybe the books will be a clarion call, a warning to current generations
Yeah.
that it could happen again, and not just in Nazi Germany, but I dare say in the United States of America. We've never seen a president do the things that our current president has done. Hopefully, when he's out of office and his regime is no longer in charge, we can return to some semblance of morality and
Yeah.
legal authority and goodness again. I can
Yeah.
only,
I hope so. That a lot of people say that you can't put side by side Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, but I can rattle off a list of things that are similar,
yeah, I
and
can.
it's awful. It's absolutely awful, and yeah, it's happening right under everybody's nose, and it's so blatant about it as well.
Mhm.
At least Hitler had some decorum about him of trying to hide what he was doing. But yeah, I hope it's over soon. I really do.
Yeah, well, I think, that this is a warning for our time.
It is.
We better heed those warnings
Yeah.
before it goes completely out of control.
So, Flint Whitlock, thank you so much for being with me today. It's been a fascinating conversation yet again.
And
And
if I could throw in a little commercial break here,
yeah,
uh,
sure.
if anybody wants a copy of the Beasts of Buchenwald or Survivor of Buchenwald or Buchenwald Hell on a Hilltop, they can get e electronic versions very easily and inexpensively by going on Amazon.com and ordering it from there.
And I'll be putting links down below.
Okay, wonderful.
Um, so everybody go out and buy this because it is a fascinating read. And yeah, it is unfortunately a sign of our times now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so
So
much for having me on your podcast.
that's okay. And what do you have coming up next?
Well, as I made reference to, I just had a new book, my 17th book just came out in November, titled Patton and the Battle for Sicily. Always been fascinated by that
Oh
and
wow.
done a few years of research on that. And
Hmm.
of course, anybody who's seen the movie Patton remembers the competition between him and Monty.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's all true. It really did happen. It wasn't and now I've started work on another book with a Buchenwald theme about um, a fellow named Martin Zomer, who was the chief jailer at Buchenwald. They had a prison within a prison, if you can believe that, where he tortured and killed hundreds of prisoners with his bare hands. And no, there have been some articles written on him, but this will be the first book about him. So we're working on it. I've got my friend over in Weimar, Germany. He's helping me with the research. And so maybe in a year or so, they'll have me back on the
Oh,
program.
definitely more nightmare reading for me.
Right.
Well, like I say, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been awesome. And
Thank you so much.
all I can say for now is Take care.
You too.
Take care. Bye
Ta-ta
bye.
for now.
Bye bye.